I'm Bryony and welcome to our rescheduled Wildlife Watch. I'm here with my colleague Stuart.
Thank you, I'm Stuart, and you can see that I got the raw end of the deal. I'm stuck in the office while Brian is currently out at the top of Clee Hill, really making the most of the nice weather at the moment. And we'll be checking back in with Bryony in a little while. Just to fill you in, though, we've got lots of plans, so we're going to try and cram as much as we can into the next half an hour to 35 minutes, including a little cutaway to Colin, our Chief Executive. We'll be having some gardening tips from John Hughes from his own back garden. Matt Hawkins is going to be talking about one of his favourite animals, and we'll also find out all about nature recovery networks with Joe.
And before we get started, we just want to say a massive thank you to everybody who's got involved with 30 Days Wild. We've had over 1,200 people sign up this June to take part. You have been doing all sorts. You've been looking at beetles, you've been climbing trees, you've been cycling, or if you're like me, you're spending the week walking the Shropshire Way. Woo!
So the 30 Days Wild campaign has been a really great way of getting people to reconnect with nature, to find their inner child and to go out and experience things like nature reserves and their local green spaces. But nature reserves are brilliant for people, they're really good for our health of course, but they also serve another purpose. So now Colin Preston, our Chief Executive, will give you a bit of an idea of just how important nature reserves are.
We're here at Hollybanks, one of the more important trust sites, particularly in recent years, acquired in 2008. As the incidence of flooding has increased across Shropshire and beyond the Marches, it has become more apparent that not only is this great for wildlife, but it's actually great for actually beginning to manage the flood excesses of the River Severn and the Vyrnwy, which meet just down the road from here, and that then cause devastation in places like Worcester and Gloucester and obviously in Shropshire. What the Trust has tried to do is to reduce the intensity of agriculture here, an intensity that's been going on for the last 100 years, and then prior to that was managed and modelled by the works of the church, who began to put up all the argues, the dikes, to defend these areas from flood. And prior to all that was the enclosures that built all the hedges, or planted all the hedges, that we see around us at the moment. So for the last 400 years this landscape has gradually intensified, and now we're at a sort of tipping point where we're saying we need to de-intensify it so it can actually perform a natural function, a nature-based solution if you like, to help solve some of the flooding issues that are wrecking our communities up and down the River Severn. Hollybanks has become sort of more of a special place since the Trust took it on in 2008. The bird life we see here has gradually increased. In this field, for example, this was all ploughed, regularly flooded, reseeded, a crazy thing to be doing in what was then an intensive arable landscape. But now there's a little hint of African savanna about it. Red kites fly over here. We've just seen a heron go over. Egrets were here for the first time this winter, and regularly, for many decades in fact, whooper swans have flown all the way in from Greenland and Scandinavia, and they overwinter here for much of the time. And you'll hear the peeping of teal as well regularly through the winter, and we still have the last few breeding curlew here, and occasionally, only occasionally, we hear the call of the cuckoo. It's one of those places that is increasingly very, very special. It's special for wildlife, but it's special going forward as well. Here we have an opportunity to reduce the risk of flood. We have the opportunity to look at climate change and how that's going to affect our lives, and actually build places that will absorb carbon, reduce the impacts of climate change, but also create an amazing landscape that is good for wildlife. Wildlife becomes one of the sort of nature solutions, if you like, to our lives going forward here in Shropshire.
A huge thank you to Colin for his ongoing support to the Trust. You might not have known this, but he's actually due to retire this month, but due to the COVID crisis he's had to postpone that for a little while to get us through, so thank you so much.
So thank you to Colin. Over the last 300 or 400 years that he's been, sorry, not quite as long as that, he's been at the Trust for a long time. Now the Trust was set up in 1962. Colin's been here for 25 years of that period, and during the time that Colin's been here we've seen the number of staff increase to well over 50 staff, and we've also seen an increase in the number of nature reserves thanks to our ability to raise funds to acquire land. with that in mind, we'll now hand over to Gareth Egar, one of our reserves officers, and he will be talking a little bit about what the reserves team have been up to during the COVID crisis.
Okay, my name's Gareth Egar. I'm the North Reserves Officer for Shropshire Wildlife Trust, and we're here at our Earls Hill Nature Reserve on the edge of Pontesbury, which is absolutely beautiful. Things have obviously been a little bit different for the reserves team during lockdown, as they have for everybody. I've been finding myself a lot more in the office, which I guess I would much rather be out here on these wonderful reserves, but we've made the most of the opportunity. For some while now, we, led by myself, have been looking at reviewing our whole management planning system, how we do it, how it works for us, and then once we've got a system that works better than the current system, we can review all of our reserve management plans. And it's one of those things which, you know, you've always wanted to do, but there's always been pressing day-to-day management to get on with. So one of the impacts we have noticed, particularly with the slight easing of lockdown, is we've been getting a lot more footfall on our nature reserves, which is great. I mean, the reserves are there for people to enjoy, and we always want more people to enjoy them, to learn about nature, and particularly to value their local green space. Unfortunately, there have been a few negative impacts. With the dry weather we have noticed an increase in fires. We've had fires at the Arkle, at Cathston Common, at the Hollies. We've definitely noticed an increase in litter on some of the sites. Ground nesting birds, skylarks at Smaller Hill, for example, we feel are struggling a bit because of increased people going there with dogs. And then here at Earls Hill, we've even had an effect with nesting birds being disturbed by climbing. It's a popular climbing spot. Climbing goes on every year, usually in good harmony with nesting birds. But I guess with places like Wales unavailable for climbers, they've been looking for other places to come that they perhaps have never been before. So we've definitely noticed an increase in climbers, and that has had an impact on disturbance to nesting birds, unfortunately.
So we have 41 nature reserves here in Shropshire, and it doesn't matter where you live in the county, there will always be a reserve near you. Some of the reserves are home to very special wildlife, from rare butterflies in the Oswestry Hills to declining songbirds like the pied flycatchers in the Arkle woodlands, but there are often lots of hidden species at reserves that you could easily overlook. Matt Hawkins recently discovered one of his favourite species while at work at Earls Hill, and here he is to show off some of those specimens.
So, what we've got here is a lovely specimen of one of the UK's native reptiles, and even though it looks like a snake, it's actually a lizard. It's a slow worm, or they're also called blind worms, and they were called blind worms because they've got the tiniest little eyes. If you ever can handle a slow worm and you touch it, you'll realise they're really silky smooth, and that's because the scales of a slow worm don't actually overlap, so they're very tight fitting. One of the major differences between lizards and slow worms is, I don't know if you can see their face, but if you're really lucky she will blink just like that. So snakes don't have eyelids, only lizards have eyelids. And the other thing is that lizards also have ear holes, which snakes don't do. So the way that snakes lubricate their eyes, rather than blinking, they'll actually lick their eyes. And you will see her poke her tongue out, and what she's doing, she's tasting the air, so they can get a really good idea of what's around them from that kind of taste. So slow worms are burrowing lizards. So during the day they'll be kind of underneath things, and they tend to come out in twilight. And they're also they give birth to live young. So rather than laying eggs, which is what sort of grass snakes will do, they'll actually give birth to miniature slow worms. They also do this amazing thing which other lizards do, and this is why you have to be really careful when you handle them. They do a thing called automise. So if they're attacked or they feel threatened, and this is why you have to be careful when you handle them, they'll actually drop a segment of their tail, and the tail will be on the ground kind of wiggling away, and then anything that's attacking them will actually eat the tail, and then the slow worm can kind of crawl off and kind of hide away. And they are suffering in the UK. Mainly, one of the main reasons is due to domestic cats. So domestic cats really prey on slow worms, and they've got no defence against that. So amazingly, the slowworm is a really long-lived animal, and in the wild they've been recorded to living up to sort of 30 years old. I think there was one in captivity that lived 54 years old. And because of that longevity in terms of predation, that's why if an adult male's taken out and killed, that's why it can impact numbers, because they are so long-lived. We should really encourage slowworms into our gardens because they are carnivorous. One of their main food sources is things like slugs and beetles. So in terms of if you're growing vegetables, actually having slowworms in your garden is a really, really good thing. So yeah, they're great. If you want to have a look at the slowworm.
Cheers, Matt. Wow, I love a slowworm. They are really amazing creatures.
So slowworms are one of many species that are in massive decline across the UK. Like so much of our wildlife, but we're losing them at a rate of knots. Insects are also in decline, and when you really think about it, the picture's looking a little bit bleak, but there are answers out there. So what we'd like to do now is just hand over to Joe Phillips, who is our Conservation and Data Officer, and Joe will give us a bit of an update on some of those solutions.
Alright, my name is Joe Phillips and I am the Conservation Officer Evidence and Data at the Shropshire Wildlife Trust. Wildlife in the UK is in serious decline. We're losing the buzzing sound of summer, half of our bumblebees species are in decline. Our kids aren't finding mini beasts in our gardens anymore. 41% of our insect species are threatened with extinction. Many of our furry friends are threatened. 26% of mammal species face extinction. And the foundations of our existence, plants, are struggling. Almost 1 in 5 species are at risk of extinction. The reason for this is that we are destroying habitat. When we develop our land for housing and infrastructure, this land not only becomes inhospitable for many species, but it also acts as a barrier for wildlife to travel between suitable patches of habitat. The solution is to provide 30% more space for nature. We need to improve the quality of existing patches of habitat, make them bigger, and join them up with existing patches of habitat and new ones. Here at the Shropshire Wildlife Trust, myself and other colleagues are implementing this solution through the Nature Recovery Network. We are working on restoring habitat and creating new habitat to increase the abundance of wildlife by 30%. We're doing this in a multitude of ways: planting trees, restoring peatland from arable land, and ensuring road verges remain uncut. These are just a few examples.
So we talked about how important nature reserves and the countryside are so important for wildlife, but our gardens are also becoming increasingly beneficial. Our back gardens cover an outstanding 1 million acres. That is a lot of space for nature, but only if we only knew how to care for it. I certainly have had a trial and error stage in my gardening. So to help us out, we have got our garden guru, our resident Shropshire gardener, John Hughes, and he's going to take us for a tour around his very nice looking wildlife friendly garden.
So this is a Pyracantha. At the moment it's in flower. The bees absolutely love it, but it's also where the blackbird nests and the sparrows like to hang out in here as well. So this is the lavender hedge. Smells glorious, the bees love it, and of course at the moment it's covered in cuckoo spit. And inside that cuckoo spit there's a little creature called a frog hopper. Red currants, I like to think they're for me, but of course the blackbird has most of them. So it's a delight having stone walls around my garden because you can get all sorts of things growing on them. So this blue thing here is a campanula, and let's see what else we can find. And this is called wall pepper or rock stonecrop. Wall pepper because it's got a peppery flavour if you eat a bit of it. This is my very favourite wall plant. This is called fairy foxglove, and I first saw this in the Burren in Ireland and I had to grow it, and it thrives on my walls. This is my mini meadow, not very big but just the right size for my garden. All sorts of wildflowers in here, but the one to look at is this one. This is yellow rattle. And yellow rattle parasitises the grasses and keeps them down and allows the wildflowers to thrive. Doesn't matter how big your garden is, whether it's the rolling acres of a country estate or a window box, you can always make space for wildlife.
Now, I've never actually let John know this, but I'm quite jealous of his garden. I've tried quite unsuccessfully to turn my garden into like a blossoming wildlife haven, but I think you really do have to put the effort into it, as John has proven. But gardens, it doesn't matter how big or small, they can be turned into wildlife havens with a bit of work. And we can start to have our own little impact and make a difference for the local wildlife. Now, one of the species that is currently massively in decline is a species that we're all very familiar with, and you may even see one in the garden if you're lucky enough. But this is a species that was numbering over 30 million just 50 years ago and is now down to less than 1 million according to the latest figures. And that species is the hedgehog. But it's not all doom and gloom. We've got an absolute fanatic hedgehog officer, Catherine Jones, who is now going to talk to you a little bit about one of her projects called Hedgehog Heroes.
Hello, I am the Hedgehog Officer Trainee for the Shropshire Wildlife Trust, and I am here in Little Wenlock, the village situated in Telford. And I'm here just to basically talk about how hedgehog friendly it is and how that really helps our species by coming together just like Little Wenlock has. So a lot of you may have known that I was planning to do a project here on basically making Little Wenlock even more hedgehog friendly. They have lots of residents that are very passionate about hedgehogs, and they have some fantastic gardens here, fantastic green spaces, wild spaces. It's absolutely an ideal example of what we want for our hedgehogs as a species. And the biggest part of Little Wenlock that's so important is the thriving community. Everyone comes together because there's so little a population here. Everyone knows everyone, everyone works for the same thing, that they all have the same ideals, and it's such a lovely place just to be a part of. There's a nice little figure that says that hedgehogs are actually declining at the same rate that tigers are worldwide. So that's not very good. Before the millennium, we actually had well over 30 million hedgehogs in the UK, and we're now looking at just under 1 million. How Little Wenlock, for example, has combated this is the whole village is quite nicely surrounded by fields with great field margins, hedgerows, perfect habitats for hedgehogs to be in and to move around. But not just that, the residents here, because they're such a nice community, very well knitted together, they all actually actively want their gardens to be wildlife friendly. What people can do if they want to follow Little Wenlock as an example is, for a starter, make their garden hedgehog friendly. So get some log piles in your garden, get a wild area. One little wild corner can make a world of a difference. They run miles and miles every night, so a whole connectivity is the most vital thing you can do for a hedgehog. They desperately need to get into your gardens, even if it's just to move on to the next one. You can provide hedgehog houses if you don't have particularly wild areas. They're definitely used. Use some straw or dried leaves as bedding. And a big important one is providing supplementary food. A lot of the residents around here in Little Wenlock do provide food for hedgehogs. They provide water, which is vital, especially in the hot weather that we've had recently. And that can be a lifeline, a difference between life or death for a lot of hedgehogs. Little Wenlock in particular are such a brilliant example of pulling together as a community, not just individually doing what they can in their own gardens. The fact that I've not spotted a single piece of litter, there's plenty of bins everywhere, such friendly, nice all together people that believe in the same thing, and that's loving their village, loving their area, loving where they live, which in turn means they love the wildlife that's living there as well.
For more information on Hedgehog Heroes, you can find loads of information on the website, and you can even contact Catherine to express an interest. So if you live somewhere that you think you could encourage the local community to get involved and to make your town or village hedgehog friendly, then please do drop Catherine a line. We've also got lots of other information on our website, so it doesn't matter what you're interested in when it comes to the natural world. We've got information on nature reserves, lots of wildlife projects, but really quite importantly is how you can get involved and how you can take action, because of course the more of us that take action, the more of us that write to MPs and make people realise just how passionate we are about wildlife, the more of a difference that we can make. Now, we've done all the cutaways now, but we have got a few questions that have been sent in prior to this session tonight. We weren't too sure if there'd be hundreds of thousands, I'm sure there won't be that many of questions, but we thought we'd give a few members the opportunity to ask questions, which we have basically picked out of the hat now. And the first question I've got is from James in Wem. Hello, James. And James has got a question regarding beavers. So James would like to know when or where or if beavers may be getting released in Shropshire, and the answer to that is not at the moment. Now we are in the process of looking at the possibilities of beaver release, but what I should reiterate is that these aren't beavers that are being released purely into the wild. These are beavers that are being released into what we call trial enclosures, so areas that are actually fenced off, and the hope is then they will manage local sites, so they'll improve like wetland habitat in local areas without having a detrimental impact on surrounding farmland. But there's a lot of consultations to do yet. We've still got to raise the money for a start, and the hope is that we'll continue to raise funds if we get funds come through at some point. Who knows, but you'll have to watch this space. Another question from Marie in Telford, who was really quite concerned about insects and would like to know why insects are disappearing. So she's mentioned that she's seen a lot less insects in her garden this year. And I mean, there's so many reasons for the decline of insects, and it's not just local to Shropshire. Insects are plummeting in numbers right the way across the world. Largely due to factors such as pesticide use, that really doesn't help insect populations. But this year we've seen some really quite extreme weather, and I fully expect that the really extreme dry patches that we've had, the dry spells, followed by some pretty extreme stormy conditions, really aren't ideal for insects, and insect breeding and life cycles are really quite dependent on a stable climate. So I imagine that the unpredictable climate over the last few months has certainly had an impact on insects. But we don't know fully how much the climate is impacting insects until, of course, we've monitored this for the next few years. So we'll always be doing something to try and stop that decline and stop the decline of any species, including the many millions of insects that, of course, we depend on just as much as the things that eat them. So we do see that where there's insects declining massively, things like swallows and house martins haven't got the food sources, so we'd expect to see a knock-on effect to those other species too. So insects really are an essential part of the ecology of the whole planet. Now there's another question here which you may think that I've chosen out of favouritism for my favourite species, but this is a question from John, who lives near Bishop's Castle, and he was just wondering about whether or not pine martins in Shropshire might be predating grey squirrels. And I'd love to say that based on the research that's been happening everywhere else, well not completely everywhere else, but certainly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, it seems that where there are pine martins moving into woodland and grey squirrel populations, they do seem to cause a slight dispersal of the population of grey squirrels, which in turn can then create a big habitat area which is grey free and suitable for red squirrels to move into. Whether or not that's the case in Shropshire is very, very difficult to say, because we haven't really seen that much evidence of the pine marten poo. So pine marten poo would be very useful. We could basically look at what the pine martens have been eating, so we'd be able to determine just how much of their diet is made up of grey squirrels. At the moment though, there's a lot of grey squirrels in Shropshire and not very many pine martens, so it's going to take a few more pine martens to have any kind of impact on the grey squirrels. And the only way that pine martens are going to improve in numbers is to have more habitat, so that there are plans afoot to increase forestry cover in Shropshire, but that'll be for another talk at some point in the future. Now, I've spent so long answering that question, I apologise. I've just about got enough time for another question. I've got another couple here, but I've also got a question from Mick, who lives quite close to the River Severn in Shrewsbury. And Mick was quite concerned. He's seen quite a few American mink around this year and wanted to know if there were any plans to control mink numbers. Now, any kind of control of mammals through culling is obviously a very, very controversial subject. It can really get people quite emotional. So in the case of mink really do have quite a massive impact on our local wildlife. So where mink have got into areas where there's water voles, we've seen water voles completely disappear in those areas 9 times out of 10. And of course, American mink, as the name would suggest, they're not from the UK. They've been released here, not officially, but released from farms as far back as the 1960s, and they're having a huge impact on our native wildlife. Now, actually trying to control mink is a really, really difficult thing to do. Like the grey squirrels, they're great in numbers and they can cover quite a big area, they can hide, and you really need some very skilled people to go out to do that control in the first place. Now, we're not actively involved as a trust in the culling of mink, but that there are other people, I know there are landowners in Shropshire that are really quite conscious of the fact they're going to lose their water voles and kingfishers, dippers and things like that the mink may predate. So we're not involved, but other people do a small amount of mink control in the county. So that's about all the time I've got for with questions today, but hopefully everybody has enjoyed the first show. Now, I was going to show some camera trap footage as well. I did a talk on camera trap footage a couple of weeks ago, and to be honest, it's a really quiet time for mammal activity. I don't seem to be getting much in the way of anything very interesting to show everybody tonight. But hopefully I'll do another talk and an update in the next few weeks on otters and pine martens.
So that's all the time we have today for our first live show. Thank you so much for joining us. If you did enjoy it and you'd like to do more shows, see more shows like this, then please comment below and we'd love to do it again. We also want to remind you that Shropshire Wildlife Trust is a charity and we really heavily rely on public support to help protect wildlife and to manage our nature reserves. If you aren't already a member, please consider signing up online for as little as £3 a month for individual membership.
So please do consider joining us. You can find all the information you need on our website, www.shropshirewildlifetrust.org.uk, and that's about it for tonight. So thank you very much for tuning in for our first ever Wildwatch, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime.